So I ended the last video by making the rather mystical sounding statement that for Derrida, difference can be understood as the world, existence, life, death, and or the cosmos, writing itself. Though this writing, this arco-writing, occurs completely without what we might think of as an intending author, a position of origination. What do I mean by this? Let's keep reading Derrida. So we're still on 62, we'll move to 63. This is just on 63, sorry. Okay. So difference, or the pure trace, permits the articulation of speech and writing in the colloquial sense, just as it founds the metaphysical opposition between the sensible and the intelligible, then between signifier, signified, expression, content, etc. If language were not already, in that sense, a writing, no derived notation would be possible, and the classical problem of relationships between speech and writing, the classical relationship as spelled out by the entire history of philosophy and certainly by the modern science of Saussurean linguistics, this classical problem of the relationship between the two could not arise. Of course, the positive sciences of signification, like Saussure's linguistics, can only describe the work and fact of difference. Sorry. The determined differences and the determined presences that they make possible. There cannot be a science of difference itself in its operation, as it is impossible to have a science of the origin of presence itself, that is to say, of a certain non-origin. A certain non-origin. This is yet another name for the originary trace, for difference, for originary synthesis. In Chapter 3, Part 1, Chapter 3 of the Grammatology, Derrida will survey a few attempts to construct a positive science of grammatology. We didn't talk about this chapter much in class. But he argues there, as he does here, that such a science would have to be a science of the origin of presence itself, something that perhaps only quantum mechanics, which post-dates some of which doesn't quite post-date, but in some sense Derrida might not have been very familiar with it, that perhaps only quantum mechanics can only asymptotically approach. But let's bracket out his claim about a science of a certain non-origin. Let's put that to the side for a second and simply point out his argument concerning Saussure here. The dream of a science of meaning or of signification that limits itself to speech or sound images, as Saussure's does, is certainly capable of dramatic advances and insights. Derrida agrees, after all, with the notion of arbitrariness, and he fully supports the idea that meaning emerges from the difference between signs. But Saussurean linguistics, Derrida argues, fails to give an account of that difference and to honor its own insight concerning arbitrariness. In its descriptions of writing as exterior, deviant, different, other, Saussure does not realize that he is actually describing the very structure that possibilizes the difference between speech and writing in the narrow sense, signified and signifier, and that also guarantees that any attempt to jettison the deprivileged, deviant term writing will fail, that the deconstruction of Saussure's edifice is inescapable. Saussure's preoccupation with dismissing writing gives away how speech, even in his own text, seems to require writing. Indeed, as Derrida emphasizes and Derrida explicitly is arguing, speech is a writing if by writing one refers to an operation radically at odds with logocentrism. And I talk about that in the first part of this 6th lecture series. That sort of radical and ontological operation of writing or arca writing. There would be no formation of speech without writing, in the narrow sense, as an exterior term, as a term opposed to speech, and without an arca writing that subsists between this opposition, securing its continued hierarchization as well as its immanent play, which is to say, in a sense, securing its own insecurity. So let's keep reading Derrida. This is on page 63. Difference is therefore the formation of form, but it is, on the other hand, the being imprinted of the imprint. End quote. It is, in other words, difference, the possibility of ordering the world, language, speech, into a system that seems transparent in a meaning, in an identity, form, method, or technique. But it is also, however, the imprintedness of these traces, the source, or in some sense, the non-source, of their menacing resistance to being present. Right, so in some sense, Derrida seems to be setting up his own binary between the being present of a sign or of a meaning and the being imprinted of the trace. Let's try to read the rest of the paragraph, in which Derrida will become more specific about his reading of Saussure against Saussure, right, using Saussure, as many of you have noticed in your own readings of the Grammatology, that he's using Saussure against himself, right? So this is going to be a long passage. It is well known that Saussure distinguishes between the sound image and the objective sound. I've spoken about this a little bit already. He thus gives himself the right to reduce, in the phenomenological sense, the sciences of acoustics and physiology at the moment that he institutes the science of language. The sound image is the structure of the appearing sound, which is anything but the sound appearing. It is the sound image that he calls signifier, reserving the name signified not for the thing, to be sure. It is reduced by the act in the very ideality of language, but for the concept, undoubtedly an unhappy notion here. Let us say for the ideality of sense. And then he quotes Saussure. I propose to retain the word sign to designate the whole and to replace concept and sound image, respectively, by signified and signifier. This should all be familiar to us by now, right? We know this already, okay? But Derrida goes on. The sound image is what is heard. Not the sound heard, but the being heard of the sound. It's important to get this right. Being heard is structurally phenomenal and belongs to an order radically dissimilar to that of the real sound of the world. One can only divide this subtle but absolutely decisive heterogeneity by a phenomenological reduction. The latter is therefore indispensable to all analyses of being heard, whether they be inspired by linguistic, psychoanalytic, or other preoccupations. So the latter part of that paragraph, Derrida, and I can talk with people one-on-one about this if they're interested in it, but Derrida is pointing out an affinity between Saussurian linguistics, psychoanalysis, other methodologies and fields, and phenomenology, which was a rather crucial branch of philosophy, especially for Derrida, right? A lot of the scholars he's quoting here, a lot of the philosophers he's quoting here, Husserl, Heidegger specifically, are phenomenologists, I think. And I think I'm right on that. And of course, writing at the same time as Derrida is another major phenomenologist, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who Professor Galen Johnson, professor of philosophy at URI, is is a well-renowned specialist in. Right? He specializes in the philosophy of Merleau-Ponty. But anyway, that is not that important. I just wanted to mark out what Derrida is doing at the end of that paragraph and go on to say this about that long passage. So, about all that, Derrida, working with Saussure, is developing a radical difference or opposition at the root of modern linguistics. The difference between the being heard of a sound, meaning perception, sensation, sound image, its imprintedness, and the sound itself, a biophysical composition of frequency, amplitude, waves, oral hardware, and mental software. We might rephrase this difference as the difference between the physical and the psychic, the body and the mind, the world and consciousness. These oppositions are made possible by archewriting, a difference that possibilizes the space between them and also undoes that space through a deconstruction of presence and absence, interior and exterior, the trace and the world of the trace. This sense of writing as difference, or writing as difference, is neither inside nor outside, neither sensible nor intelligible, neither spoken nor written in the narrow sense. Skip to page 65. Let's read the first sentence. Let's just read the first sentence of the first full paragraph that is there. Derrida writes, "It should be recognized that it is in the specific zone of this imprint, that is the imprint, the trace, the difference that subsists between all of these oppositions that he's been analyzing, right? The imprint and this pure trace in the temporalization of a lived experience which is neither in the world nor in another world, which is not more sonorous than luminous, not more in time than in space. That differences appear among the elements, or rather produce them, make them emerge as such, and constitute texts, the chains and the systems of traces." Okay, so what is Derrida doing here, right? I mean, we are pretty far away from his main, what seemed to be his main thesis so many videos ago, and at the beginning of the semester, his main, as it were, beef with the history of philosophy, history of theology, that exteriorized writing, right? We're pretty far away from this, and we're in some pretty deep metaphysical waters. But it seems to me that what Derrida is trying to get at, he's trying as best he can, right, to articulate this most radical, most fundamental ontological operation. It is this imprint, this pure trace, this difference, this archewriting, all these concepts, referring in some sense to the same operation. It is this that Derrida is attempting to articulate. It is that which subsists in the blank spaces, that holds up any moment of temporalization of a lived moment. And by temporalization, Derrida simply means, right, the attempt to construct for oneself the sense of a present moment, right? That every present moment, every experience, right, has all these empty pockets in it, right? And those empty pockets, just like the empty pocket within every single sign between signifier and signified, there is this whole chain of traces, this retention of the past in every lived moment that makes it impossible to imbue any present moment, no matter how minute, no matter how short a span of time one cuts, right? That it carries with it and retains within it all these traces that lead elsewhere, that keep every present moment from ever being sort of self-evidently full unto itself. Difference, for Derrida, is not just the producer of difference, of opposition, of the partial identity of terms through this difference and opposition. Moreover, it is the specific zone in which whole chains, webs, and texts, as systems of traces, are produced and cross and recross. These systems include not only different technologies of communication, but also whole fields of discourse, including history, science, literature, popular media, the internet, communities, politics, law, etc. In many ways, this is why Derrida challenges the notion that there can't really be a history of writing, that there can't really be a science of writing, because all of these fields, all of these systems of traces, all these discourses are derivative of a much more fundamental kind of writing. All of these are forms of writing, imprints that operate as traces and as lures. Let's read the rest of this paragraph. Okay. It's a difficult one. All of this is difficult, I understand. These chains and systems cannot be outlined except in the fabric of this trace or imprint. And this trace or imprint, remember what Derrida is talking about, is the pure trace, archwriting, difference, right? That deep ontological fundamental operation. The unheard difference between the appearing and the appearance, between the world and lived experience, is the condition of all other differences, of all other traces, and it is already a trace. We'll come back to that. Continue on. This last concept is thus absolutely and by rights anterior to all physiological problematics concerning the nature of the engram, or the unit of engraving, or metaphysical problematics concerning the meaning of absolute presence, whose trace is thus opened to deciphering. Then in italics, Derrida writes, the trace is in fact the absolute origin of sense in general, which amounts to saying once again that there is no absolute origin of sense in general. The trace is the difference which opens appearance and signification, articulating the living upon the non-living in general, origin of all repetition, origin of ideality. The trace is not more ideal than real, meaning not more conceptual than material, not more intelligible than sensible, another way of saying the same thing, not more transparent signification than an opaque energy, and no concept of metaphysics can describe it. And as it is a fortiori anterior to the distinction between regions of sensibility, anterior to sound as much as to light, is there a sense in establishing a natural hierarchy between the sound imprint, for example, and the visual or graphic imprint? The graphic image is not seen, and the acoustic image is not heard. Mysterious, mysterious sentence. The difference between the full unities of the voice remains unheard, and the difference in the body of the inscription is also invisible. Every time I read this paragraph, I get chills, and I can't really tell you why, because a great deal of it escapes me. Okay. But if we're wondering about the extent to which Derrida is willing to push his argument in the Grammatology, it is here that we look, that difference and writing, as it were, go all the way down, right? This is not just a matter of literary interpretation. This is not just a matter of developing a science of language. This is the matter of, as Derrida says in the beginning of chapter 2, it is at the root of the problem of the historicity of history, of the scientificity of science. It is at the root even of a difference between mere appearing, right? Things that appear to us in the world, and our sense of the meaning behind them, right? Or our making of meaning about those appearances. Even the difference between experience and world itself, Derrida says in this paragraph that that difference that the trace of that difference is itself already a trace. Right? So we can't go back any further than a trace. We can't go back any further than difference. We can't go back any further than this weird operation of arca writing. You can't go any more upstream than that. There is no fully present operator behind that complex and complicit operation. As far back as we can go, what you will continue to find is nothing but webs, chains, and systems of traces. And so Derrida at the end of this paragraph says, if that's the case, then that means there is no natural hierarchy between the visual, as in written marks, and the audible, as in what we hear and what we hear ourselves say, so that it is completely nonsensical to hierarchize speech and writing, and that insisting on difference as the primary operator, we can bring about, as Derrida is attempting to do here, an entire deconstruction of the particular opposition between speech and writing, but also the much more metaphysical opposition between presence and absence, which then leads to all sorts of other deconstructions throughout the rest of this book. Let's read the beginning of the next section. And I'm sorry, this third part's going to go on a little long, but I want to keep going. I want to push this as far as we can go, and in some sense, I'm going to push it until I'm uncomfortable actually trying to lecture on it, okay? So let's read the beginning of the next section, the hinge, which is a section we didn't really get to talk about in class, okay? But I hope we can talk about it when we come back around to chapter 2 later in the semester. So let's begin to read the next section, because here we get another important component of this whole unstable conceptual apparatus that Derrida is setting up, okay? So let's read the first paragraph of that, bottom of 65 onto 66. Origin of the experience of space and time, this writing of difference, this fabric of the trace, permits the difference between space and time to be articulated, to appear as such in the unity of an experience, of a same lived out of a same body proper. This articulation, therefore, permits a graphic, that is a visual, tactile, or spatial chain to be adapted, on occasion in a linear fashion, to a spoken, that is phonic or temporal chain. It is the primary possibility of this articulation that one must begin. It is from the primary possibility of this articulation that one must begin. Difference is articulation. So now we're coming around to articulation like I promised we would. I just want to say from the get-go that maybe one of the most common argumentative gestures Derrida does is to always change the question of analysis or study, right? So that instead of thinking about, for instance, what is actually the difference between speech and writing, let's say, Derrida will always change the question to saying, well, what is the condition of possibility by which we understand speech and writing to be different at all? Right? So that phrase, condition of possibility, is an important one for those of you really interested in reading Derrida here, but also as you might encounter more critical theory or literary and cultural theory in other classes, okay? So, all right, back to articulation. Articulation as a word, etymologically, means the art or the activity of joining two things together, but it also means the actual material of the joint itself that does the joining, right? Or that's why Derrida also titles this section the hinge. So think of a hinge that both, that in some sense, as a word, refers to the activity of joining a door onto a door frame, but also is the actual name for the object itself, that is the hinge, right? In language, joints are neither sensible nor intelligible. right? I can see, I can touch, I can think about an actual joint holding a door to a door frame. But what about the joints that hold words together into sentences, right? That form chains, that is the glue holding the chapters of a novel together, right? That the joints of language are neither sensible nor intelligible. By joints in language, I do not mean linking verbs or coordinating conjunctions. I'm not talking about grammatical categories here. I mean the silence between spoken words. The space between written marks and letters. The natural, as Saussure understands it, relation between speech and writing. That is the space or joint between them, the difference between them. Difference is articulation in a double sense. It is the activity of joining and keeping separate, but it is also the absent joint itself. Difference is the actual empty space in between words and sentences and meanings that can, through the operation of difference, infiltrate and bring about the deconstruction of these sentences and meanings and concepts. Writing in the narrow sense refers to the marks on the page. Writing in the radicalized sense refers to the actual spacing between words and sentences and lines and meanings. The articulation, in other words, of traces into chains and texts. Writing is not just the marks on the page for Derrida. Writing is that which subsists beyond, beneath, and between the marks themselves. Let's continue. Derrida quotes Saussure here. He says, "This is indeed what Saussure says, contradicting chapter 6 of his Course in General Linguistics." And then he cites Saussure. "The question of the vocal apparatus obviously takes a secondary place in the problem of language. One definition of articulated language might confirm that conclusion. In Latin, articulus means a member, part, or subdivision of a sequence. Applied to speech, articulation designates either the subdivision of a spoken chain into syllables or the subdivision of the chain of meanings into significant units. Using the second definition, we can say that what is natural to mankind is not spoken language, but the faculty of constructing a language, i.e. a system of distinct signs corresponding to distinct ideas." Derrida goes on to comment, "The idea of the psychic imprint therefore relates essentially to the idea of articulation. Without the difference, that is, without the articulation between the sensory appearing and its lived appearing, that is, the mental imprint, the temporalizing synthesis, which permits differences to appear in a chain of significations, could not operate." This should make sense to us, yes. Imprinting and articulation, the appearing and the appearance, the sensory and the lived, the physical and the mental. Let's read the next two sentences. That the imprint is irreducible means also that speech is originarily passive, but in a sense of passivity that all intramundane metaphors would only betray. This passivity is also the relationship to a past, to an always already there, that no reactivation of the origin could fully master and awaken to presence. The fact that the trace is irreducible to a simple origin, presence, materiality, or meaning means that all traces are always already articulated. They are always already effects of other traces to and against which difference, or difference we should say, joins them. This is not a passivity of the weak or innocent against the strong or cruel, examples of what Derrida means by intramundane metaphors. An already necessary connectedness, leakiness, and difference from another here and now. This is what Derrida means by a passivity that is, quote, the relationship to the past, to an all was already there, that no reactivation of the origin could fully master and awaken to presence, end quote. So let's keep reading. Quote, this impossibility of reanimating absolutely the manifest evidence of an originary presence refers us, therefore, to an absolute past. This is what authorizes us to call trace. Here we go, another definition of trace. That which does not let itself be summed up in the simplicity of a present, end quote. These sentences corroborate all that I've said about the trace in my previous video, part 5. Supplement to and displacement of Saussure's theory of signs. What Derrida calls absolute past here is the unheard and invisible difference that nevertheless joins traces that cannot be present unto themselves. If I had more time here, I don't want to keep going on, I would keep reading these pages all the way up to the end of the chapter. Because it is in these pages, right, that we find an important corrective when we start thinking about what Derrida means by the absolute past, and when he also starts talking about an absolute future, that are woven together in the temporalization, or we should say the composition of a present moment, right? A present moment which, of course, is not fully present. Right? We find here an important corrective to anyone reading Derrida and listening to these lectures and saying, well, obviously every present moment is related to history and is moving forward. There's nothing profound about this. This objection assigns to time a linear form of past presence, present, a present moment, and future presence. A sequence, that is, a successivity, a model, as Derrida writes, of one moment leading to the next. But of course, if no moment is ever truly present, our model of time cannot be linear. And the objection above, the objection that Derrida will continue to levy throughout this chapter. The objection of the person who's saying there's nothing profound here. That's what I meant here, sorry. The objection above does not really address that which Derrida means when he talks about the retention and protension, the unity of a double movement of retention and protension, of a past and a future within a present. When he calls this the trace. So what is our model of time, if not linear? What does the reconceptualization of time require? What is time according to this notion of trace, of the pure trace as difference, as the difference that subsists at the heart and in between the most radical binary definitions? To answer that, we would need more time. We would need more time, which luckily we have in class, but sadly which I don't have right now. Okay, I simply just want to mark out for you how Derrida, in some sense, doesn't solve many problems for us, but he beautifully creates a lot of them. And if we're sympathetic to him, and day to day I'm more sympathetic than others, they're ones that can preoccupy us, and that we can certainly bring to a novel like Cloud Atlas. Okay? A novel like Cloud Atlas, which explicitly, in its own way, is problematizing how we think of history, how we think of time, how we think of the line of causation as a sort of unsophisticated and unsatisfying model of how we think about how one moment leads to the next. All right. So I wanted to summarize quickly, but I think in some sense I might just leave it there. That what I want you to take away from this long lecture series, I'm looking at the time, I'm so sorry that it's so long, is I want you to get a sense of how far down Derrida wants to take his concepts. Okay? And I think you'll get a sense, and you have gotten a sense in section 2, and in the chapters we'll read from section 2, that Derrida really, really, really wants to test out these concepts in the fire of the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Right? And as many of you have already found out, this is not simply a matter of Derrida saying that words can mean whatever we want them to mean, right? Or that we can assign to them what we want them to mean, or to object that, well, of course words don't naturally have definitions to them. We come up with them. They're social constructions that are brought about by the consensus of a community and blah, 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 right? These objections miss the point of what Derrida is getting after. And I hope, if nothing else, when listening to this, what probably sounded at times like a confused lecture, that you were able to grasp that a little bit. Okay? All right, well, I'll see you on Wednesday, and bring your Derrida, and I look forward to talking with you about the supplement, that dangerous supplement.